The door opened and the room changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. A production assistant stepped in holding a single black rose, no bouquet, no card tucked in cellophane, just one stem, dark as midnight, laid across both hands like something ceremonial. She set it on the vanity table without a word and left just as quietly as she came. Whitney Houston didn't move. She was 24 years old, sitting in a dressing room somewhere in Midtown Manhattan, 40 minutes from walking onto a stage in front of thousands of people who had paid money to watch her be perfect. Her makeup was done. Her dress was hanging. Everything was ready, except the note folded under the stem of that rose. She picked it up. 4 words handwritten. "I'll be watching tonight." No name. But she knew. If you've ever felt the weight of being watched by someone who sees the real you, not the version you perform for the world, you understand exactly what happened to Whitney in that moment. Subscribe and stay with us because this story goes places nobody has talked about. Not really, it started a year earlier. Maybe longer. These things always do. Robert De Niro in 1987 was not a man you ignored. He was 44 years old, coming off a decade of performances that had genuinely unsettled people. Not just moved them, unsettled them. Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Deer Hunter. He didn't act in movies so much as he disappeared into them, came back different each time, a little harder to read. Hollywood respected him the way people respect something slightly unpredictable, carefully. Whitney at that same moment was the opposite of all that. She was the girl Clive Davis had discovered at 19, singing in a New York nightclub while her mother performed on stage. He heard her and reportedly went still. Didn't say anything for a few seconds. Just listened. And then, with the quiet certainty of a man who had built careers out of thin air before, he decided she would be the biggest female artist in the world. He wasn't wrong, but the path he built toward that destination was very specific. Whitney's debut album had come out in 1985, and it didn't just sell, it dominated. She became the first debut female artist to have 3 consecutive #1 singles. 3. In a row. The critics wrote about her voice with the kind of language people usually save for natural phenomena, for things that don't have explanations. Instrument was the word they kept reaching for. Not talent, not skill. Instrument, as if God had built it and then handed it to her and walked away. But Clive Davis had something equally precise in his mind. The image had to match the voice. Clean, radiant, untouchable. Whitney would wear white. Whitney would smile wide. Whitney would not be associated with anything complicated or dangerous or raw. The music would be immaculate. The public presentation would be immaculate. Everything would be immaculate. What nobody talks about is what that actually costs a person. The girl who grew up in Newark, New Jersey, the daughter of gospel singer Whitney Houston, the girl who had learned to sing in the New Hope Baptist Choir and had stood on stages since before she could drive. That girl was not a product. She was a person, with contradictions and hunger and an appetite for people who weren't easy to understand. And in the fall of 1987, at a private event in New York City, Robert De Niro walked into the same room as Whitney Houston. Nobody who was there has ever given a full account of what happened in those first few minutes. But what people do remember is that De Niro didn't approach her the way most men approached famous women. He didn't perform. He didn't try. He just looked at her, that specific famous De Niro stillness, like he was memorizing something he hadn't expected to find. Whitney noticed. That's the part nobody fully accounts for. Everyone talks about what De Niro did next. Nobody talks about what Whitney felt in that moment, when a man who made his living understanding people from the inside out turned that same focus entirely onto her. Not on the voice, not on the image, on her. The calls started not long after, then the flowers, always roses, sometimes red, sometimes white, and eventually, by early 1988, black. As if he was tracking something, shifting registers, moving through a scale only he could hear. The notes were always short, never desperate, never demanding, just present, just watching. But here, right here, is where this story cracks open. Because what De Niro was doing, whatever his intentions, whatever the full picture, was the one thing the entire architecture of Whitney Houston's career was designed to prevent. He was seeing her as a specific, complicated, real human being. Not as the voice, not as the Arista Records investment, not as the girl in the white dress on the poster. As Whitney, Clive Davis found out the way Clive Davis always found out about everything. Quietly at first, then not quietly at all. The meeting happened behind closed doors, which is where the meetings that matter always happen. There's no transcript, there's no recording. But the people who knew both of them at that time describe what Clive communicated in terms that leave very little room for interpretation. This cannot happen. Robert De Niro's world, the darkness of it, the rawness, the relentless intensity that made him the greatest actor of his generation. That world would not coexist with what they had built. The audiences trusted Whitney because she felt safe, because she felt like something that existed above the mess. Bring De Niro in, and the mess follows. But Whitney sat in that room and listened to all of it. And here's the thing about Whitney Houston that people forget. Because her tragedy is so loud, it tends to drown out her early clarity. She was not naive. She understood the machine. She had grown up inside it, had watched her mother navigate the music industry as a black woman for decades. She knew exactly what Clive was protecting. She just wasn't entirely sure she wanted to be protected from this. That is the tension nobody wants to sit with, because it doesn't resolve cleanly. Whitney wasn't a victim of De Niro's attention. She was a woman standing at a fork in the road, being told by everyone around her that one path was simply not available to her. She sat with that for weeks. There were nights, people close to her said, when she would sit at the piano alone after everyone had gone home and play nothing in particular. Just press keys slowly, listening to the way each note decayed in the empty room, not composing, not rehearsing. The black roses kept arriving, each one a question she hadn't answered yet. She thought about the way he had looked at her that first night, not with the hunger that famous women learn to recognize and brace against, but with something closer to recognition. Like he had found something he recognized from a long time ago and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it either. She thought about what it meant that the most dangerous man in Hollywood had decided she was interesting. Not her voice, her. And then, in the early weeks of 1988, she made the call she had been putting off making. The conversation was quiet. She was direct, the way she had learned to be direct from a mother who did not believe in wasting words. Their worlds were too different. She had something to protect. This couldn't continue. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said one sentence. She has never repeated it publicly, and she may never. But people who were close to her around that time say that what he said made her cry. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. Because he had looked at her clearly enough to say the one thing nobody else had bothered to say, about the cage, about the cost, about what the immaculate image was actually doing to the person inside it. He said it, and then he let her go. 2 days later, the production assistant came in with the last rose. Black, one stem, one note, 4 words. And now Whitney was sitting at the vanity, 40 minutes before showtime, looking at her own reflection. The dress, the hair, the makeup that made her look like a painting, the face the world expected to see. She set the rose down. She picked up her earrings. She stood, and she walked out onto that stage. What happened next is the thing that separates Whitney Houston from every other singer of her generation. Because she didn't perform that night, she confessed. The first note hit the air, and the crowd went quiet in that specific way that crowds go quiet when they feel something they didn't expect to feel. Not the screaming silence of anticipation, the stunned silence of recognition. Like she had just spoken aloud something they all privately knew. She sang that night like someone who had just understood, for the first time, exactly what the cage looked like from the inside. And somehow, impossibly, she made the cage beautiful. She made it ring like a bell. The band behind her adjusted without being told, because that's how you know a performance is real. When the musicians feel it and shift. When the spaces between the notes get wider. When nobody rushes. They gave her room because she needed it, and she filled every inch of that room with something that cannot be rehearsed. It cannot be manufactured. People who were in the audience that night talked about it for years. Not the songs, not the set list. They talked about the feeling in the room, the sense that something private had briefly become public, and then, just as quickly, been sealed back inside something magnificent and sent out into the world. Whitney walked off that stage and into the wings. Someone handed her a towel. She stood there for a moment in the dark, breathing. She never picked up De Niro's calls again. 4 years later, she would meet Bobby Brown. And the world would watch, confused, then alarmed, then heartbroken, as she moved steadily toward everything Clive Davis had spent a decade building walls against. The rawness, the danger, the kind of person who looked at her and saw a human being first and a product never. It didn't end well. We all know how that story goes, but here is what the story of that black rose and the man who sent it actually tells us. If we're willing to sit with it honestly, the cage was always going to break. Maybe not then, maybe not with him, but something in Whitney Houston was never going to stay inside those white dresses forever. The voice that moved millions was built from something real and complicated and deeply human. You cannot separate those two things. You cannot have the sound without the soul that produces it. Clive Davis understood the music industry. He understood it better than almost anyone who has ever worked in it. And he was right that De Niro's world carried risk. He just didn't understand that the danger wasn't coming from outside. It was already inside her. It had always been inside her. It was the same place the voice came from. Whitney Houston carried that black rose and everything it meant for the rest of her life. In every performance, in every note she held a half-second longer than she had to. In every moment when an arena went silent because something in her voice reached past the show and touched something true. She gave us everything she had, every single piece of it, even the parts she was never supposed to show. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of everyone's expectations and the terrifying pull of something real waiting on the other side of all that? Tell us your story in the comments below. And if this is the kind of storytelling you come here for, make sure you're subscribed. There is so much more where this came from.